Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Sexual Harassment in the Workplace, hosted by Wider Opportunities for Women. My name is Sarah Gonzalez-Posinski. I am the Director of WOW's Economic Security for Survivors project, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping. Your lines have all been muted to ensure that background noise doesn't interfere with the presentation. If you have any trouble or technical issues, please feel free to use the meeting chat icon that's located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to contact the WOW administrator. The chat icon looks like a little dialog box. Following the presentation, there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions of our speakers, but feel free to submit questions throughout the conversation in the meeting chat function. You can direct it over the group chat, or you can send it individually to me. Again, I'm the WOW administrator. Thank you all for joining us. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, Wider Opportunities for Women is a national research, advocacy, and technical assistance organization located in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to build pathways to economic security, independence, and equality of opportunity for women, families, and elders. Our work promotes policies and practices that increase job quality, improve gender equity, and empower women economically. One of the many issues that can impede women's economic security is violence and abuse. The Economic Security for Survivors project explores the intersections of violence and abuse with economic security. We know from our work in the field with partners here in D.C. and transitional housing programs and other direct service work we've done that economic security is fundamental to the safety and recovery of survivors of intimate partner sexual violence and stalking. The goal of our project is to help victim services, the criminal justice system, and community stakeholders address the economic obstacles that often prevent survivors from moving forward. We know that the ability to work is essential for survivor safety and independence. However, often their work environments may not be safe. While it is well known that abusers have a tendency to interfere with survivors' ability to work and bring violence to the workplace itself, sexual harassment within the workplace also creates a hostile environment and can further traumatize survivors. Recognizing this, it's really important to empower survivors with the knowledge they need to identify when sexual harassment has occurred and what their options are to address harassment. I know that many of you on the call today are advocates and work directly with survivors. You can provide great opportunities to educate survivors about potential harassment that they may experience in the workplace, help prepare them for those experiences, and help them move forward if they do experience sexual harassment. So in this webinar today, we want to share this important information about sexual harassment. Our guest speakers will provide an overview of what sexual harassment is, what practices are prohibited, the law, and what steps victims can take following an incident. We will also discuss various strategies that can be used to help prevent sexual harassment in the workplace and how advocates can help in that role. So I'd like to introduce our guest speakers today. First, we are joined by Teo Reyes. Teo is the Research Director at the Restaurant Opportunities Center United. ROC United seeks to improve wages and working conditions for the nation's low-wage restaurant workers. Before coming to ROC, Teo served as a community organizer with the United Farm Workers, co-directed and was a staff writer at Labor Notes, and was the director of the Tri Global in North America. So I'm thrilled to have him there to talk about some of the experiences he's seen with his research in the restaurant industry. So thank you, Teo, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. I would also like to introduce my colleague, Lauren Sugarman, who's going to be filling in for Katie Onicello Spiker. Lauren directs WOW's non-traditional occupation programs and contributes to WOW's workforce advocacy initiatives. She provides program support and technical assistance on equal opportunity policy and practices to the workforce development system, community-based agencies, educational institutions, and industry stakeholders. She leads WOW's advocacy for improved funding for women and girls training and gender equity policies and practices in the workforce development and career and technical assistance education. Lauren is a wealth of knowledge in supporting women enter non-traditional occupations so that they can achieve greater levels of economic security, and I'm thrilled to have Lauren on the call today. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
And finally, I'm joined by my trusted colleague, Mallory Dusenberry, who's our Associate Director of the Economic Security for Survivors Project. For those of you who work with us, you know that Mallory provides technical assistance and training to groups that regularly interact with survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. She's worked with service providers, transitional housing programs, and the criminal justice system to help improve the economic security and safety of survivors by enhancing existing programming. So thank you, Mallory, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So first, we want to start by answering the questions of why are we looking at sexual harassment for survivors, and why is it particularly important that we consider this? So Mallory, I'll turn this over to you.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So when examining the intersections of violence and economic security, there are really two main issues at play here. First, the cost of violence or abuse, as well as economic abuse perpetrated as power and control, often leads victims to become economically insecure. So for example, violence comes with high costs in terms of physical and mental health care, lost wages, and expenses to participate in the justice system. In addition, offenders may perpetrate economic abuses that range from controlling a victim's access to finances or stealing paychecks, to compromising credit and forcing bankruptcy, to interfering with a victim's employment. And the second big factor that's at play here is whether that economic insecurity was a result of abuse or other factors. Whether it's a result of abuse or other factors, it is a significant barrier to safety and recovery. It can keep survivors within those abusive relationships for longer. The very well-known Mary Kay study says that 74% of survivors stayed longer with an abuser because of financial issues. And all of these factors combine to create dependency on an abuser to cover basic needs and prevent them from leaving. They also frequently result in the inability for survivors to access resources and supports in order to heal and maintain future stability. And ultimately, this leads to a vicious cycle of poverty and vulnerability for survivors. So one of the best ways to escape this cycle is through safe and adequate employment. Survivors who have jobs that pay a livable wage and provide essential benefits will be able to leave an abuser, recover from an assault, and remain on their own. These financial resources are also necessary to address the added financial costs from the violence itself, secure justice system support such as a civil protection order, and recover from economic abuses. This can include hiring a civil attorney, engaging in credit repair, and expunging a criminal record for coerced crimes. Ultimately, employment is the best way to ensure that survivors are resilient and less vulnerable at all ages, including into retirement, when financial abuses by a family member may increase. Unfortunately, survivors' workplaces may not always be safe due to workplace sexual harassment. So first of all, sexually aggressive or suggestive behaviors that can constitute sexual harassment can re-traumatize survivors and can trigger their PTSD, anxiety, or other mental health issues that might be a result of their previous trauma and violence. Especially because sexual harassment is often an abuse of power, much like domestic and sexual violence, it can severely set back survivors' recovery and further interrupt their ability to work or concentrate, which can also put their employment at risk even more. Re-traumatization can be a particular concern if the survivor is in a predominantly male-dominated field or if they don't have a great deal of additional workplace rights at that organization. So furthermore, being a survivor of violence may shape how they respond to sexual harassment in ways that does not support their safety. In the first, survivors may feel that they have to tolerate the harassment and avoid reporting it for all of the reasons that we've recently discussed about why survivors need employment. This could lead to longer-lasting harassment, increased re-traumatization, and possibly escalating harassing behaviors up to even assault. The second response in which survivors resign to escape sexual harassment at work reduces their ability to recover from violence and increases their vulnerability and the likelihood of returning to an abuser out of dependency. So for these reasons, among other, we're talking today about sexual harassment, how they can respond, and why this is important for advocates to know about. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Sarah to get into the details of what sexual harassment looks like.
Great, thank you, Mallory. So it's very clear that this is an important issue for us to be focusing on and to not only educate ourselves about, but the survivors we are working to improve their lives. So next we're going to talk about what is sexual harassment. And here I have a few different scenarios that we're just going to walk through to see if you view this as sexual harassment. Up in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you will see there's a little flag. I'm going to ask for you all to raise your flag if you believe these scenarios count as sexual harassment. So the first one is a supervisor repeatedly suggests that a subordinate join him for drinks after work to discuss opportunities for advancement. She refuses and later finds out that a coworker with less seniority is promoted to the job she expected to fill. So if you could take a moment and raise flags and see if you all agree that this is sexual harassment. I'm seeing a few people have found their flags. Okay, looks like a lot of you are thinking this is. Okay, great. Teo and Lauren, maybe you could talk a little bit about why this is or isn't sexual harassment and what elements are really important here.
So this is Lauren, and I will tell you that, although this seems like it may be innocent and fairly casual and something that might not be considered sexual harassment, in fact, social activities outside of the workplace really are not part of an employee's responsibilities, and they often are set up in fact, it may be at a place that somebody feels uncomfortable going to. In the construction industry, for example, where I was a worker, a lot of times after-work activities took place in bars that had dancers. So there may be reasons that a female employee or a male employee may not feel comfortable going to one of those places. So setting up an environment either in the workplace or outside that can be a hostile work environment really does constitute sexual harassment. What's especially important in this one is that, in fact, it was an occasion where work was done and somebody was able to receive an advancement opportunity in a job. So something to be aware of.
Thanks, Teo. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I would only add that it is a really difficult situation. For example, in the restaurant industry, the workers get together after work, often to drink or to socialize. And if you're not able to, because you have to go home to care for children, or you have whatever other responsibility you have to attend to, it becomes very difficult if there is if work is being discussed after that. The fact that this is a sort of repeated suggestion also, I think, is also adds to the problematic nature of it as well. I think being able to learn to document these types of behaviors when they're experienced is really crucial to be able to deal with them effectively.
And I want to just echo what Teo said about repeated acts of invitation. So in the law, when you talk about a hostile work environment, repeated acts. So we can talk a little bit more about that when we describe the law, but that's an important element of this.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we're moving on to our next scenario. The driver of a concrete truck who regularly delivers to the job site where a female laborer works makes a habit of leering at her and moving his body in a sexually suggestive way. When she complains to her crew leader, she says there is nothing she can do about it. He doesn't work for the company. Does this constitute sexual harassment? You all can raise your flags again. I see some people. Okay, great. So again, I'll ask Teo and Lauren what your responses are to this scenario.
Well, again, I'll speak from my experience working on job sites, and unfortunately this was not an uncommon experience. One of the things that makes this complicated is that the sexually harassing behavior was not done by an employee of the same company that the female laborer worked for. So one of the things that complicates this is that who has responsibility to stop sexual harassment. And in this case, if the female employee complains about this, or if the supervisory employees that she works for have reason to be aware of this, it would constitute a violation of the law. So and she obviously in this case did complain about it, and he said he couldn't do anything. He would then have reasonable standing to bring a complaint internally or externally if she needed to. So the company the harasser works for could also be held liable. This is not uncommon that you'll find multiple employers working in the same location.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to reiterate that it's the crew leader's responsibility to stand up to this behavior, and it's probably good to acknowledge that the crew leader might be be uncomfortable with addressing it, just because this is an issue that in general, even if that person is sympathetic, they might be really uncomfortable. It's their responsibility. They need to take care of it, and even if they need to draw on others to support them in doing this, it's something that they need to address. It's complicated because there is it's a different company, but there is a peer relationship with the driver, so that crew leader has to take responsibility for what's happening on the site.
Great, thanks. So we have two other quick scenarios that we're just going to run through. The next one is anonymous graffiti with sexual innuendos and pictures of a woman's body parts are scrawled on the outside walls of the workplace, but no one complains about them. You all can go ahead and raise your flags, and we can have the response from Lauren and Teo again. So this one might be a little tricky. Okay, we've got a few people raising their flags that this constitutes harassment. Teo, Lauren, do you have a response?
Teo, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Well, I mean, the problem is that it's at the workplace, so it's still the employer's responsibility. The issue is not if someone complains about them. I think the issue is if someone is offended, and it leads to a more hostile environment. Is how I would interpret it. And so this is part of creating a zero tolerance atmosphere, which is rare. Well, at least in the restaurant industry, is hardly ever the case. So there needs, management needs to take care of this. And you can't have a workplace that has that kind of graffiti on it. I will defer to Lauren.
So again, I'll just refer to some of my previous experience where this actually happened to me. I work as an elevator constructor in the construction industry, and often had to stand waiting for a skip hoist to go to another floor in the construction site. And as I would push the button, there might even be graphic descriptions of body parts and scrawled around that. Extremely uncomfortable environment. It told me that I wasn't welcome. Sometimes my name was attached to that. But as a very young worker, I had no sense of my rights in the job. I didn't even really understand what sexual harassment was at that point. And this was back in the 80s when sexual harassment law was just being codified. So, I didn't know that I had the capacity to complain. I was been embarrassed to complain, and yet it really did make me feel uncomfortable and out of place. So, as Teo said, it's up to the employer to be proactive. This is obviously something that the supervisor can see. And one of the things we do is encourage all workers to report this, and it doesn't necessarily need a complaint to be sexual harassment. And one other thing I'd say is you can't vote on sexual harassment. What offends somebody may not offend somebody else, but that's not how you decide.
Point. Thanks. All right, and just our last one real quick. A customer in a restaurant gave sexually suggestive looks and is constantly stared at a female waitress. He then starts showing up during all hours of her shift to ask her out on dates and make comments about her appearance. So again, raising flags. I see a couple going up. All right. And thoughts from our speakers on the harassment elements here?
So I'll take lead if that's okay. Yeah, this is actually a common enough occurrence, and it's a problem because it's first of all it's dangerous, but it creates a very unhealthy work environment. And the bigger problem is that management often will tell staff to smile in a situation such as this, which is completely just makes the problem worse. And again, it's a situation where management needs, when the waitress does need to speak up about this issue because someone else might not know about it, but management needs to take proactive action on this. And we've had workers who've had to change their routes home after work because they've had customers that try to follow them afterwards or try to get their numbers, et cetera. This is very it's serious and dangerous.
Thanks, Teo. Lauren, if you don't have anything else to add, we can move forward in talking more about the myths and facts.
Great. So one of the things that there is still a lot of confusion about is the fact that sexual harassment only happens to women and only men are the offenders and perpetrators of sexual harassment. I want to just point out that we've really only been having a public conversation and a defined conversation about what sexual harassment is since the late 70s, early 80s, when it was actually entered into the legal language of the law, the federal government. So part of the reason we raise these, we do an exercise around the myths and facts on sexual harassment is to give people a chance to engage in that conversation, which is really still going on, and modifications to the law, both good and unfortunately some bad, have been happening since the early 80s. So part of, I think, our hope here is to not only raise your awareness, but give you some tools to raise other people's awareness. So while we're presenting this as a opportunity just to hear the facts directly from us, this is more of an exercise where you would encourage people to engage in dialogue. So it is true that women are the primary targets of sexual harassment, but it is also true that men can be targeted, and women can be the offenders, and women can target members of their own gender. So currently 16% of the cases before the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission have been filed by men. And I want to also just mention that even though we have large numbers of people, both men and women, filing sexual harassment complaints, it's only a really small percentage of the actual people who experience it. So just a small minority actually go ahead and file complaints. So the second myth is the seriousness of sexual harassment is exaggerated, and that we hear a lot, especially when you're doing a sexual harassment, that this is presented as something way too grave. People should just lighten up, not take it so seriously, and that it's really just harmless flirtation. So I assume many of you may have heard something along these lines as well. But really, there's, most sexual harassment is not about flirtation. It is about power and using power to make somebody feel uncomfortable. One of the best measures to identify if this is frightening or insulting or offensive is to ask people to think, would this behavior be okay if it was to happen to a spouse, a partner, a daughter, a son, a sister, an aunt, a brother? Would it be okay to have a newspaper article or a church news article written about this example? Would somebody want that to be public information? And so asking those kinds of questions can help determine how it really differs from social interest flirtation. And again, one of the other ways to know that this really is a huge problem for targets of sexual harassment is that it often causes serious harm, including psychological distress, health problems related to stress, health problems related to not being able to focus on your work and having perhaps safety issues come up because you're distracted. And it means people will often move jobs or leave jobs and perhaps not have another opportunity to get one, or they may miss overtime or time assignments because they may not want to work in the same environment where somebody has been targeting them with sexual harassment. We'll go on to the next myth.
Sorry about that. Let me move forward.
Did I just do that? I'm sorry.
No, don't worry. We'll get right back to where we were.
I was controlling. Okay.
All right, there we are.
Okay. So another thing people often say is that, oh, this used to be a problem, but really we've addressed it, and a lot of people are now aware of the situation, aware of what it constitutes, and that we really don't have to worry about it so much. But in fact, sexual harassment continues to affect about 40 to 60% of working women and 10 to 20% of men. The EEOC addresses 15,000 cases approximately each year, and as I said, that's really a small minority of what is actually happening out there. Many sexual harassment cases are resolved by proactive, assertive employers and sometimes by proactive and assertive employees. But it still is a huge issue and one that needs to continually be educated about and addressed. So we often hear that sexual harassment has to have sexual intention in order to count as harassment. And people sometimes see this, well, didn't or she didn't say, in order to keep your job, you have to sleep with me or you have to do X with me. But in fact, sexual harassment does not have to be specifically connected to that kind of sexual activity. So it can be the kind of graffiti, it can be jokes, it can be casual conversation that might involve stories about conquest, rape. It can be a variety of activities that don't necessarily mean somebody wants to have direct sexual relations with another coworker or a supervisee. So, and again, as pointed out here, that does not really matter what the intent of the offender is. So anything that is unwanted sexual attention does constitute sexual harassment. Finally, often are told that if the target of sexual harassment stands up to the harasser, they can stop it or they can discourage it. You might hear this in terms of, well, if they just spoke up, said they didn't like that, or if they just didn't wear that outfit to work, or if they just didn't go along with those kinds of jokes, the sexual harassment would stop. And in fact, many people are powerless to stop sexual harassment, and they have a lot of reasons to fear speaking up. They may be the victim of retaliation, they may be the victim of bad evaluation, they may be the victim of losing their job. So it's the consequences for women of speaking up, or the consequences for any target of speaking up to stop sexual harassment may be harder to overcome than the sexual harassment itself. So, and also, even though somebody may one day be able to stand up to it, the next something may have happened in their lives, their personal lives, or on the job that makes them less capable. And I think this is an important thing to think about with survivors of sexual violence, is that something may in fact trigger something that, means they're reenacting the scenarios they may have experienced as a victim of violence, and that may lessen their capacities to stand up to a harasser.
Yeah, it's a great important point, Lauren. So in interest of time, let's talk briefly about the definitions. We've kind of walked through them through the scenarios and through some of the myths and facts. But exactly how is sexual harassment defined? And Teo, maybe I'll turn to you first to just talk about the definition.
Okay. Yeah. So very quickly, it's just to reiterate, it's really just any unwelcome verbal or physical, any sexual behavior, and it's a lot of times it's simply explicit statements. In the restaurant industry, it's normalized as kitchen talk, and because of that, it's sort of seen as just normal behavior, but it is in fact sexual harassment. And it's any type of remarks which the recipient finds offensive or objectionable, makes the recipient uncomfortable, and creates this hostile atmosphere. So that's the key item, is that in fact it applies to any type of sexual behavior that is unwanted or that a person finds makes a person uncomfortable.
Okay, great. And continuing for that, what are the prohibited behaviors?
So there are four kinds of prohibited of sexual harassment behaviors. Certainly the quid pro quo, that you'll get something in return for some type of sexual behavior. The hostile work environment, the sexual favoritism, being treated differently, and harassment by non-employees or customers. The quid pro quo is a lot of cases it's pressure for dates, pressure for sexual activities, the hostile work environment, like I mentioned, the kitchen talk. It's just the sort of sexual banter that occurs that's unnecessary and can create a hostile environment. And then harassment by customers who come in and feel, and because of the constraints of the environment, workers are not adequately trained to respond to. But Lauren, add, please.
So I want to just add a couple distinctions between four primary kinds of sexual harassment. When harassment is of the quid pro quo, which actually translates from the Latin to this for that, only one instance is required. So if a supervisor asks an employee for sex in exchange for their job or for a promotion or for overtime assignments, that constitutes automatically a violation of the law. If a coworker puts another coworker in that same position and that coworker complains to a supervisor, if a supervisor is aware of that instance and does nothing about it, that also constitutes a violation of the law. In the hostile work environment setting, you do need repeated acts of unwanted sexual attention. And so it means that, somebody, if a supervisory employee sees what's going on, they can see pictures, they can see somebody perhaps being uncomfortable in the presence of another worker who may be fearing or rubbing up unnecessarily against another employee. If they are aware of that, or if somebody complains once and it does not stop and then complains to a supervisor, that then constitutes the repeated acts of unwanted sexual attention. Sexual favoritism is distinguished by the fact that if another employee who is acquiescing to requests for sexual favors or sexual relations, whether those are pressured or not, and that enables them to get benefits on the job, including overtime or promotion or a better evaluation. And the victim of that is the employee that is not receiving those same benefits. And then harassment by non-employees, I think we've gone over, and there are lots of explicit examples in the industry. Teo represents the restaurant industry. the one that I have the most experience in construction industry, where it still is the responsibility of the employee supervisor or the overall workplace manager or developer, contractor, general contractor to create a workplace free of sexual harassment. So this is a little bit of a laundry list of all of the examples within the cross over a range of occupations but are specifically challenging for women who work in what we call NTO occupations or non-traditional occupations, jobs that have been traditionally male-dominated and where women are less than 25% of the workforce. Unfortunately, the majority of women are concentrated in very few jobs, and so women who work in these traditionally male-dominated fields are often very isolated, which complicates the experience of sexual harassment. And also, they may feel that their jobs are on the line. They may feel that they are only there because of affirmative action agreements. That, in fact, that is often the way we get women into these jobs. It may put undue pressure sometimes on women to feel like then they really have, they have to prove themselves over and over. So, it's not uncommon, as I've mentioned, on a job site to see inappropriate graffiti or pictures. There can be a lot of background noise, background conversation in the shanty, on the workshop floor, in and around the gang box. It can be even names of tools or how you measure things and the adjectives used for that. It can be remarks about the target's sex life. It can be as simple as, hey, did you get any over the weekend? Where somebody just feels like, hey, that puts me in a really uncomfortable spot. If that person says that out loud or a supervisor hears that, that constitutes sexual harassment. Maybe as something as big as the traditional stereotype of construction workers whistling and leering at women as they walk by a construction site. So these things that sometimes we laugh about are really that have a serious impact. So even something as simple as one of the last things on this list, being stared at constantly, or just the pet names that diminish somebody. You think about this in terms of racial harassment as well, and understand that some of the language that would be totally inappropriate and demeaning and degrading or demoralizing or isolating somebody from the team based on their gender or race can be a form of harassment. In the most egregious cases, assault and rape can take place, and Teo alluded to what can happen with an over-aggressive customer could lead to a stalking situation. So, in my case, one time on a job site, it was them taking my coveralls, my boots, my hard hat, my tool belt, stuffing it with rags, and hanging it outside the 7th floor, which I had to see as I came to work. And so, it almost was like they hung in effigy. So I'd say, oh, that was just a prank or just a joke, but clearly it was a message to me that I was different, I was not wanted, and watch out.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, part of the reason that we wanted Lauren on this call is because of, being in a male-dominated workplace, sexual harassment and harassment of that source is unfortunately very common and something we need to make sure we're raising survivors' awareness of, particularly because these are good jobs and great career opportunities for survivors. And to that, we also invited Teo to join us because of, the prevalence of some of this harassment in the restaurant industry, and because it's so accessible for survivors who are starting off following abuse with a new job, and because those jobs are quite prevalent now in today's economy. So, Teo, I'm just going to turn it over to you. Or, sorry, Lauren, did you have? I'm just going to move past this slide here since we only have 20 minutes left. You can see there's just some of the statistics here about how prevalent this is and how much of a problem it is in the non-traditional fields.
And I just want to say that jokes about rape are really still very prevalent in our culture, and I still hear a lot of complaints from women working in male-dominated fields that these jokes can really dominate a conversation informally or even sometimes formally, especially if we're talking about sexual assault survivors. This can really be a huge issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Teo, you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing happening in the restaurant industry.
So, we know it's the largest source of sexual harassment claims. 34% of all EEOC claims regarding sexual harassment come from restaurants. We survey restaurant workers around the country, and we had been just asking about sexual harassment and had about a 10% response rate, and we knew that was not right. So we created a much more in-depth tool to research this topic. And by asking people about the behaviors they experienced, because a lot of people have this barrier to saying that they've experienced sexual harassment, but instead talk about the behaviors, whether it's getting sex, being stared at, being asked on dates, being rubbed up against, being having to hear unwelcome banter, all these things. We found that, in fact, both men and women are experiencing high levels of sexual harassment. Of course, women are experiencing higher levels, but they are experiencing from management, from coworkers and customers between, as high as many as 80% of workers experience sexual harassment from coworkers, nearly 80% from customers, and 2/3 from management. And we also found that it was, in fact, tied to the tipping system as well, and that rates of sexual harassment were much higher where you have a tipped subminimum wage, where the customer pays most of the employee's wages. This creates a environment where the way that the employee has to interact with the customer is conducive to all forms of sexual harassment, and then this seems to spread out to the way that the coworkers interact with each other, as well as management, so that we saw higher rates from all sources where in the states where, for example, the tip minimum wage is only $2.13 an hour. So this is one of the reasons that this is so important, and particularly for women who are close to 70% of all tipped workers. And make up over half of the restaurant industry. So they're in a situation where by law they depend on customers for their wages, and their interactions with those customers can then determine what wage they make, which leads to a negative, potentially very negative environment, which seems to then reproduce itself with coworkers and supervisors, as I mentioned. Having trouble going to the next slide. There we go. And so, in this survey, we surveyed 700. We surveyed close to 700 workers specifically on sexually harassing behaviors, and we found, a majority, found that it was an uncomfortable aspect of their working life. Nearly 60% said that was the case. We asked them, along with behaviors, all the behaviors that they experienced from workers, from management, and from customers. We then asked how they felt about them. And I want to go back to what Lauren said about how different behaviors can be interpreted differently. And in this set of questions, we asked a set of questions whether they thought it was common to be touched inappropriately, whether sexual harassment behavior was scary or unwanted, whether it was an uncomfortable aspect of their social work life, or it was normal part of their work life, whether they thought it was normal, and by that meaning that it was daily or constant. But we also asked them if they thought it was a fun part of their social life, one, in order to ensure that people weren't all just answering the same way every question, but then we see, that you have 60% saying that it is an uncomfortable aspect of social life, and, 28% or so saying that it was a fun part of their social life. So that's points to some of the challenges in facing this behavior and speaking out about it, because it's important to really do that consciousness raising around it, so that everyone can understand why it's inappropriate. And then also, I just want to point out, we asked whether, depending on tips, led workers to accept inappropriate behaviors, and over half of workers said that yes, the fact that they had to depend on tips did make them more likely to accept things that made them very nervous or uncomfortable. Thank you. And just to go back to a question of normal part of the work life, and by normal is just it's constant. The majority of workers said they were harassed on a monthly and weekly basis from coworkers, management, or guests. Very high percentage, said that they experienced it weekly and monthly. Actually, monthly and weekly. And how did they respond to it? They felt that they'd have greater repercussions if they reported harassment from management than from coworkers. So from coworkers, they felt like they had, more of a peer-to-peer relationship. So they didn't feel the stakes were as high as if they were reporting sexual harassing behavior from supervisors. And of course, from guests as well, the added problem with guests is that, in fact, they had management suggesting that they had to, engage in flirtatious behaviors or dress sexually or dress differently in order to attract a higher tip. So that was an added complication from the way supervisors were responding to sexual harassment from customers. But so as a result of all of this, we found that 25% of women seek out new work because of the sexual harassment that they experience, and that 36% of workers have experienced depression or anxiety as a result of the sexual harassment as well. I will say, among the responses, 70% of workers spoke to their family and coworkers about their experience. So there was a desire to reach out to others to discuss the experiences they were having, even if they weren't necessarily originally framing them as sexual harassment behaviors. And nearly 90% of workers felt they would be able to talk to their supervisors if they were part of a larger group of workers. So it's important to note that having that, being able to have a support group amongst coworkers is really a crucial element in order to confront this and change the environment, especially where it is so extreme as in the industries that we've been discussing.
Great. So speaking of some of the impacts and reactions to sexual harassment, regardless of what form and who it's perpetrated by, sexual harassment can have serious effects on employees' well-being and on their work. A lot of these are similar to consequences that we see from domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking that takes place in the workplace as well. So each of these impacts, either alone or in combination, can result in missed days of work and lost wages, missed promotions, mental health and physical health needs, resignation, or even termination. Not to mention the fact that one extreme end of the spectrum of sexual harassment behaviors is sexual assault and rape, which you all know comes with its own range of devastating negative costs and consequences. So we have a couple examples of the statistics here. A lot of them are very old, which speaks to the need for further research, but also the possibility for further action. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah and Lauren to talk about some of the legal protections.
Thanks. And I just want to point out we have about 10 minutes left, and we still have a few things we want to cover. Absolutely must share information on the legal protections and what some advocates can do. So if you do happen to have questions, feel free to send them to us in the meeting chat, and we'll try to address them as we move forward. But in trying to keep to our time and respecting that we want to end at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Lauren, I'm going to ask that you dive into the employment discrimination law.
So I will just try to be brief. That sexual harassment law is codified under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VII, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex, national origin, race, and religion. So it was not specifically identified and defined until 1980 But the basic law is that no employee can be discriminated against. Their job duties or job activities can be adversely affected because of their race, gender, national origin, or sex. So, and that they should have, all employers must provide employees a workplace free of intimidation, insult, or ridicule based on these factors. So in 1980, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was identified. So the EEOC was formed in 1965 in order to enforce Title VII, 1964 Civil Rights Act. In 1980 is when the EEOC issued guidelines that define sexual harassment, and I think we've talked about these fairly clearly and specifically. The law is fairly brief, and so much of it still has to be interpreted, and that's why there's still a lot of lawsuits, and the EEOC has to make a lot of individual decisions about what constitutes sexual harassment on a one-by-one case. So, and I wanted to mention one other agency that also has some purview over addressing sexual harassment, and that's an agency of the Department of Labor called the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. That agency oversees any entity doing business with the federal government. Anybody that has a contract over $10,000 with the federal government is also monitored by this agency of the Department of Labor to ensure that they are providing a equitable and fair workplace and that they are providing equitable opportunities for underrepresented groups to have employment in the industries or the employers that have those contracts. So next slide. So one of the biggest things that can change the framework around sexual harassment prevention is the activities that employers take. And just like we are doing today, education and awareness is the most important factor to stop sexual harassment. There's still a lot of confusion about what it is, what an employer's responsibility is, what a union's responsibility is, what an individual employee's responsibility is, the supervisor's responsibility is. All of this can be articulated in very clear written policy that outline the specific forms of sexual harassment, identify what an employee, what actions an employee can take if they feel that the sexual harassment is not being addressed. It outlines the confidentiality procedures so that nobody has to fear retaliation. It usually should outline how long an investigation should take. The best activity an employer can do is to model appropriate behavior and to be proactively monitoring the workplace so that there won't be those cases of graffiti or inappropriate pictures. Excuse me. And then employers are obligated to take reasonable care to stop the harassment. This can mean a variety of things. It does not necessarily mean that the harasser, perpetrator, fired immediately. There's a whole range of other disciplinary action that can be taken, and this should also be spelled out in policies. It may mean that the employer who is the employee who is the perpetrator may need to be transferred to another site, and this can mean not just that they're sanctioning that behavior, but it may be uncomfortable for a target of sexual harassment to have to continue to work with the perpetrator, even if that perpetrator has been disciplined. Be careful that a target of sexual harassment is not transferred to a lesser or less lucrative employment or one with less responsibilities or less opportunities for advancement. It can be as simple as removing the offensive material. It can be a little more complicated and identify what is respectful communication on the job site. really not just modeling it, but training people. One other thing is to think about is that we say we're not talking about changing attitudes here, but you can change behavior. And it's a very similar analogy to safety issues on the job. You may not be able to get everybody to agree that safety is an important issue, but everybody has to wear a hard hat. Everybody has to wear a safety belt when climbing heights. So, and a final action, that resolution, is to make sure that any target has full restoration, so that there's no lost wages or lost opportunities for employment or advancement. Valerie, you want to have me continue on this?
I can go ahead and take this. So if discrimination, harassment, or retaliation has occurred, advocates can be great sources of information on what victims' formal and informal options are, what resources exist for dealing with the negative impacts of harassment or re-traumatization, and what community organizations might be able to help them if they choose to take legal action. So some of the recommended responses are fairly universal, while others may be a little more specific to certain industries or groups. So the ones that are endorsed by the EEOC include, making it clear that the survivor finds the actions unwelcome, that they take some sort of action, whether that's reporting to a supervisor, HR representative, union official, et cetera, and that they document, it's very beneficial to document all incidences of harassment. When advising survivors specifically, it's important to take into account how their trauma might impact their responses particularly. So if a personal confrontation isn't possible for them, maybe a written correspondence or reporting to a supervisor might be a safer option. And as we saw with the preferred responses in the ROC report that Teo was talking about, approaching a supervisor or manager as a group might feel safer and be more effective in the long run. In terms of formal remedies, there are a number of official courses of action a victim can take, whether that's filing an official complaint with an employer, with the EEOC, or taking independent action. So there's a couple of issues to be aware of with the EEOC, largely in terms of timing. It needs to be filed within 180 days in most states, unless there is a local or state law that prohibits employment discrimination on that basis, in which case it's extended to 300 days. So just being aware of the local situation. I have the website address for the EEOC here. There's a ton of information there in terms of how to file a complaint. They have online assessment tools that can help you figure out whether the EEOC is the proper agency to help you, and then they can help you with intake questionnaires and finding the correct office. I think we are closely out of time. I also just want to mention that a big thing that advocates can do is work with and educate employers, include them on any community multi-sector group or organization you are part of, and including, coordinated community response teams, making sure that they're aware of the needs of survivors and how the workplace rights of survivors, including their sexual harassment workplace rights, impacts them and impacts their productivity and the safety of their employees. So they can reach out again through CCRs, through workforce investment boards and other coordinated platforms, or through individual targeted partnership building within their communities. So we, both the S Project and Lauren's project, have a lot of resources for working with employers and industries as a whole. So if you have any questions or comments or want further information, please don't hesitate to be in touch.
And we're just going to sadly have to move through pretty quickly. The last couple of slides we had were about the role that advocates can play, and Mallory's touched a lot on what those actions have been, so you can quickly see, it's all about educating survivors about sexual harassment, what their rights are, and what options they have to move forward. And again, involving employees is a must, as Mallory mentioned. Again, we'll be sharing this PowerPoint so you can see all of the details following this meeting. We just included a couple of resources here. One is Workplaces Responds. For employers, this is a great resource to make sure they're developing policies that are compliant with some of these laws and regulations and making sure that they're friendly work environments for not only just survivors but women in general, to make sure there's equity in the workplace. The Corporate Alliance to End Partner Violence is another great resource around that. We highly encourage you to check out Rock United's work. They do great work in supporting the workers in the restaurant industry. Teo's report is there as well, where you can see more information about sexual harassment and hopefully learn more about their efforts to address these issues. And as Mallory mentioned, the EEOC is listed there again. And move forward to our last slide. I want to, if you have any quick burning questions, feel free to send them to us and we can go ahead and respond. If not, you are welcome to send them to us offline. I am so grateful to Lauren and Teo and Mallory for participating today. I think the perspectives that you all have from your industries is invaluable, because we know that sexual harassment is often prevalent in those fields, and we want to make sure that survivors who are able to starting to move forward with their lives are able to do so successfully. So if there are no other questions at this time, I believe this is probably the end of our webinar. Thank you to our guest speakers. I know there's a lot of information and not a lot of time to cover it. We appreciate your knowledge and expertise, and I hope that you'll be able to answer any questions that might be asked of us in the future. Thank you again for your help and support, and thank you to everyone on the call listening today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.